Part 1. Birth of Empire, France's first colonial dream. You can measure an empire in soldiers or ships, in borders drawn across the map, but France's first empire began not with conquest, but with curiosity. In the 16th century, as Spain and Portugal carved their way through the Americas, the French crown turned its gaze westward toward the cold, misty edge of the known world. The promise wasn't gold or cities of legend, but something simpler: trade, prestige, and the dream of a place in the global story of discovery. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, raising the fleur-de-lis above the cliffs of Gaspé and claiming the land for King Francis I. It was a symbolic act, a stake driven into the heart of a continent still barely imagined in European minds. Cartier's explorations were followed decades later by Samuel de Champlain, whose 1608 founding of Quebec marked the true birth of New France. Nestled between river and forest, Quebec became the fragile heartbeat of a growing colonial world. Unlike the conquistadors who ravaged empires for gold, the French came as traders, missionaries, and explorers. Theirs was an empire of rivers, following the St. Lawrence deep into the wilderness, then southward through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi to Louisiana. Canoes replaced caravels, alliances replaced armies. The French depended on indigenous nations, the Huron, the Algonquin, the Abenaki, for survival, trade, and knowledge of a vast land. In return, they offered goods, religion, and promises that often frayed under the weight of ambition. It was a fragile coexistence, yet one that shaped the character of French colonization: cooperative, adaptive, but always underpinned by imperial intent. The currency of this empire wasn't gold, but fur. Beaver pelts, soft and durable, became luxury goods in Europe, driving the economic engine of New France. Traders, known as coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, vanished into the forests for months or years, forging networks that reached deep into the heart of the continent. They were frontiersmen, intermediaries between two worlds, symbols of a uniquely French approach to empire, one built less by conquest than by connection. But this North American empire was not the whole story. To the south, in the Caribbean, another face of French power was emerging, darker, richer, and far more brutal. On the islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and especially Saint-Domingue, sugar transformed the French economy. The plantations were engines of wealth, driven by the labor of enslaved Africans whose suffering made the Caribbean the glittering pearl of the Antilles. Here, the contradictions of French ambition came into focus, a nation proclaiming civilization and faith even as it profited from bondage. By the late 17th century, France's first empire spanned from the icy rivers of Canada to the tropical heat of the Caribbean, with small but strategic outposts in Africa and India. It was a patchwork world connected by ships, faith, and trade. And yet, for all its reach, it was precarious. New France's population was tiny compared to the swelling English colonies to the south, and the French monarchy's priorities were fixed on Europe, on dynastic wars and continental prestige. The colonies were valuable, but secondary, an extension of royal ambition rather than its focus. Still, this empire gave France a taste of global power, a vision of influence that stretched beyond Europe's shores. Its missionaries brought Catholicism to distant lands. Its traders carried the French language across oceans. It was, in many ways, the prototype for what France would later become, a nation whose influence rested as much on culture and ideals as on armies. But empires built on fragile foundations do not endure. The same century that saw the triumph of New France would also bring the conflicts that would consume it. As Britain's colonial population surged and Europe's rivalries spilled across the oceans, France would find itself facing an enemy not in the wilderness, but in the world's first truly global war. In the frozen forests of North America and the cane fields of the Caribbean, the seeds of that downfall were already planted. France's imperial dream, so vast and promising, was about to meet its reckoning. Part 2: The Pearl and the Fur, Wealth, Slavery, and the Atlantic Empire. By the dawn of the 18th century, France's first empire had become a world divided between two realities. In the north stretched the wilderness of New France, a realm of forests, rivers, and icy fortresses where fur traders, priests, and soldiers carved a fragile foothold into the continent. In the south, under the blinding Caribbean sun, the French Empire thrived on the backs of enslaved men and women. Here, sugar was not a luxury, it was an obsession, and its production defined the empire's moral and economic soul. While New France's settlements clung to the shores of the St. Lawrence, the Caribbean islands pulsed with feverish activity. Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and Guadeloupe had become the glittering crown jewels of the French colonial world. Saint-Domingue alone produced nearly half the world's sugar and most of its coffee. The profits were staggering, so immense that the island's exports were worth more than all of Britain's North American colonies combined. It was wealth that reshaped Parisian fortunes, built aristocratic estates, and bankrolled the ambitions of the crown. But behind this prosperity lay a brutal arithmetic. On the plantations, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans laboured under unimaginable conditions. Torn from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic in chains, they endured disease, violence, and back-breaking labour in a system designed to consume lives faster than they could be replaced. Mortality rates were catastrophic. For every man or woman who survived to work, another died in the crossing or the fields. The colony's success was purchased with blood. In contrast, New France seemed almost modest. Its population numbered in the tens of thousands, dwarfed by the booming English colonies to the south. Yet what it lacked in people, it made up for in ambition. The French colonial administration sought to knit together a continental network from Quebec and Montreal down through the Great Lakes to the Mississippi Valley and Louisiana. In 1682, the explorer René Robert Cavelier de la Salle claimed the entire Mississippi Basin for France, naming it Louisiane in honour of King Louis XIV. On maps, this empire was immense, spanning the heart of North America. In reality, it was a thin chain of forts, missions and trading posts holding together a world defined more by diplomacy than dominance. At the centre of this northern experiment stood Quebec, a fortified town of stone walls and spires overlooking the St. Lawrence River. It was a world of fur traders, Jesuit missionaries, and soldiers who believed they were the vanguard of civilization. The Jesuits in particular saw their mission as divine, to bring Christianity to the First Nations. They built missions deep in native territories, learned local languages, and recorded the cultures they encountered with extraordinary detail. Their writings, though shaped by their faith, remain among the best early records of the indigenous world. This coexistence was complex. The French relied on native alliances to survive and trade, but these relationships were never equal. European diseases devastated indigenous populations. The fur trade altered traditional economies, creating new rivalries and dependencies. Yet, compared to the land-hungry English settlers to the south, the French were often seen as less threatening, partners in exchange rather than conquerors in force. Still, beneath the surface, tension brewed. France's global rivals watched with unease as its Atlantic network expanded, from sugar islands to fur territories, from West African ports like Saint Louis and Gorée to Indian trading posts such as Pondichéry and Chandernagor. France was building a maritime web that spanned oceans, but maintaining it required enormous expense and coordination. The Crown's gaze remained fixed on Europe, on wars of succession, dynastic glory, and continental dominance. The colonies were left vulnerable, defended by small garrisons and underfunded administrators. By mid-century, that vulnerability would be exposed. The competition between France and Britain, two great powers whose ambitions now stretched across the world, was reaching a breaking point. The struggle that began in the forests of North America would soon ignite the first truly global conflict. And as the drums of war began to echo across the Atlantic, the French Empire stood on the brink of both its greatest test and its most devastating defeat. For now, its plantations still glittered, its trade routes still thrived, and its map still stretched proudly across half the known world. But empires built on profit and pride rarely see the storm coming until it's already upon them. Part 3. A World on Fire, the 7 Years' War and the Fall of New France. By the 1750s, the uneasy balance between Britain and France had reached its breaking point. Both empires claimed vast stretches of North America, their frontiers overlapping in a web of rival forts, alliances, and ambitions. The Ohio River Valley became the spark. It was there, in 1754, that a skirmish between French troops and a young Virginian officer named George Washington set in motion a conflict that would soon engulf the world. What began as a colonial border dispute would ignite into the 7 Years' War, a struggle fought across 5 continents, often called the First True World War. For France, the stakes were enormous. Its North American empire, Nouvelle France, stretched from the St. Lawrence River to the Gulf of Mexico, yet its population was barely a tenth of Britain's American colonies. The French advantage lay in alliances with indigenous nations, especially the Huron, Algonquin, and Ottawa, who resisted British expansion. In the early years, French strategy shone. Commanders like Louis-Joseph de Montcalm and the Governor-General, Marquis de Vaudreuil, coordinated a defensive network of forts and rivers, turning the wilderness itself into a weapon. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and quick raids harassed British supply lines. For a moment it seemed France might hold its ground, but empires rise and fall on logistics and numbers. Britain's navy dominated the seas, cutting off France's lifeline to its colonies. Reinforcements and supplies dwindled. Meanwhile, the British colonies, with their swelling populations and militias, could field overwhelming manpower. As the war widened, France was stretched thin. It was fighting not only in America but in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and Africa. The monarchy poured treasure into these distant theatres, draining the royal treasury and fueling a debt that would haunt France for decades. In 1758, the tide turned decisively. British forces captured Louisbourg, the fortress guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence, opening the gateway to Quebec. A year later came the decisive blow, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. On a chilly morning in September 1759, British General James Wolfe scaled the cliffs outside Quebec and faced Montcalm's forces in open battle. Both commanders were killed, but the result was clear. Quebec fell, and with it, the heart of New France. Montreal surrendered the following year. The dream of a French North America collapsed in smoke. When peace finally came with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, it was catastrophic for France. Canada and all French territories east of the Mississippi were ceded to Britain. Louisiana was handed to Spain as compensation for its alliance. In India, French influence was reduced to a handful of trading posts. The Caribbean sugar islands, the engine of France's wealth, were spared, but the empire as a whole lay in ruins. A century of global ambition had evaporated almost overnight. Yet the war's consequences reached beyond territory. The loss shattered the French monarchy's prestige. An empire once seen as destined for greatness was humbled, and its humiliation came at enormous cost. The war had driven France into crippling debt, deepening a fiscal crisis already decades in the making. To pay for defeat, taxes rose and resentment spread. In Paris, Versailles, and the countryside, murmurs of discontent began to grow. The monarchy, desperate to maintain its lavish image, borrowed still more. The financial rot that would later explode into revolution had already set in. But the wounds were not only economic. The defeat left a scar on France's national pride, a wound that demanded redemption. The empire was gone, but the desire for greatness had not died. Across the Atlantic, whispers of rebellion would soon stir in Britain's American colonies. When that revolution came, France would see an opportunity for revenge and a chance to reclaim its place on the world stage. For now, though, the tricolour had not yet been born and the monarchy still ruled. The French Empire's first chapter had ended in loss and humiliation. But out of that humiliation, the fires of revolution were beginning to glow, faint at first, but soon bright enough to burn a king's crown to ash. Part 4. Revolution and the Fall of Kings. In 1763, the fleur-de-lis no longer flew over the forests of Canada. The First French Empire had crumbled, leaving the monarchy humiliated, indebted, and uncertain of its future. But the end of empire abroad would soon give rise to a revolution at home. The same forces that had built France's global ambitions, wealth, hierarchy, and the pursuit of power were about to turn inward, consuming the old order from within. By the late 18th century, the French crown was drowning in debt. The 7 Years' War had drained its treasury, and the monarchy's desperate attempt to reclaim prestige through military adventures like aiding the American Revolution only deepened the crisis. King Louis XVI inherited not just a throne but a financial catastrophe. Taxes weighed heavily on the poor, while the nobility and clergy, shielded by privilege, paid almost nothing. Bread prices soared and discontent simmered in the streets of Paris and beyond. In May 1789, facing bankruptcy, Louis summoned the Estates General, a medieval assembly representing clergy, nobles, and commoners, for the first time in 175 years. What he expected to be a manageable political maneuver became a revolutionary spark. The Third Estate, representing the common people, broke away and declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to speak for all of France. It was a direct challenge to absolute monarchy, a claim that sovereignty belonged not to the king, but to the people. That summer, the storm broke. On July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that stood as a symbol of royal tyranny. The fall of the Bastille was both literal and symbolic, the beginning of the end for the ancient regime. The National Assembly soon issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. These words, simple yet radical, electrified Europe and terrified its monarchs. France was reinventing itself, not as a kingdom, but as a republic of citizens. Yet, revolution is rarely clean. As the monarchy resisted reform, the streets grew bloodier. In 1791, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette attempted to flee, but were captured and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The revolution radicalized. By 1792, war with Austria and Prussia had begun, and the king's credibility collapsed. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, his head displayed before a cheering crowd. The king was dead, and with him, centuries of divine right. France was now a republic, but one drenched in fear. The reign of terror followed, orchestrated by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Thousands were executed as enemies of the revolution. Guillotines rose not only for aristocrats, but for revolutionaries who dared to question the government. The revolution that had promised liberty now devoured its own. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the reverberations of Paris reached Saint-Domingue, the jewel of France's Caribbean empire. There, the enslaved population listened to talk of liberty and equality and demanded that it apply to them as well. In 1791, they rose in revolt. The Haitian Revolution, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, became the most successful slave uprising in history. What began as rebellion turned into a war for independence that would ultimately destroy France's richest colony. The ideals of 1789 had unleashed forces far beyond Europe's control. Inside France, as blood flowed and enemies gathered at the borders, one figure rose through the chaos. A young Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. Brilliant, ambitious, and utterly fearless, he embodied the meritocratic promise of the revolution. In a nation weary of anarchy but unwilling to return to monarchy, Napoleon offered something new: order without the crown, power without the divine right. He would become both the child of the revolution and its conqueror. As the 1790s drew to a close, France stood transformed. The monarchy was gone, the church humbled, the map of Europe trembling. The old world had been overturned, but the struggle to define what would replace it had only begun. Out of this turmoil, one man would rise to forge not just a new France, but a new empire, an empire born not from exploration or trade, but from revolution and war. Part 5. The Rise of Napoleon, from Republic to Empire. The revolution had devoured kings, priests, and revolutionaries alike, leaving France exhausted, bloodied, and adrift. The dream of liberty had spiraled into chaos. The Republic, born in the name of reason, had nearly destroyed itself through paranoia and purges. But out of that chaos emerged a figure who seemed made for the age, a man of ambition, intellect, and unshakable confidence. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and through his rise, France would exchange the uncertainty of revolution for the certainty of empire. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, newly annexed by France, Napoleon was an outsider by birth, yet a Frenchman by destiny. Trained as an artillery officer, he was a product of the revolution's meritocracy, where talent mattered more than lineage. His early campaigns revealed a rare brilliance, calm under pressure, decisive in action, and gifted with a mind that could read a battlefield like a chessboard. When he crushed the Austrians in Italy, 1796 to 1797, he became not just a general, but a national hero. The French people, weary of instability, saw in him something the revolution had lost: strength, direction, and purpose. In 1798, he led an audacious expedition to Egypt, aiming to strike at Britain's colonial power by threatening its route to India. Though the campaign ended in logistical failure, it revealed Napoleon's grand vision. He was not content to defend France. He intended to reshape the world in its image. When he returned to Paris in 1799, the Republic was collapsing under corruption and inefficiency. In a swift and bloodless coup, the 18th Brumaire, he seized power, establishing the consulate and naming himself First Consul of France. Napoleon presented himself as the savior of the revolution, the man who would preserve its achievements while ending its chaos. And in many ways, he delivered. He stabilized the currency, reformed the tax system, rebuilt the army, and reached a concordat with the Catholic Church to restore religious peace. But his most enduring legacy was legal, not military: the Napoleonic Code of 1804. This monumental reform swept away the tangled web of feudal laws, establishing equality before the law, secular authority, and the sanctity of private property. It became the legal foundation for much of modern Europe, a revolution codified into law. Yet even as he rebuilt France, Napoleon's gaze turned outward. He saw Europe as a chessboard, its pieces waiting to be moved. In 1804, in a moment of theatrical defiance, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head. It was both the rejection of old monarchy and an embrace of absolute power, a symbol that France's destiny now rested in his hands alone. What followed was a decade of near-constant warfare, the Napoleonic Wars, a series of campaigns that transformed Europe. At Austerlitz, 1805, Napoleon achieved his masterpiece, annihilating the combined armies of Austria and Russia in a single day. At Jena and Auerstedt, 1806, he crushed Prussia. By 1807, he had humbled the Tsar at Tilsit, forcing Russia into uneasy alliance. His empire stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Poland, with client kings and brothers ruling conquered lands under the shadow of French dominance. But the French Empire of Napoleon was unlike the colonial empires before it. Its capital was Paris, its prize the continent itself. Yet beyond Europe, France still clung to imperial ambitions in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, though many of those ambitions were now lost or waning. Napoleon's focus remained on the Old World, on reshaping its political order around his rule and the revolutionary principles he claimed to embody. At home, he was both reformer and autocrat. He censored the press, controlled the church, and ruled through centralized bureaucracy. To some, he was a tyrant. To others, he was the fulfillment of the revolution's promise, meritocracy and progress enforced by discipline. To most, he was simply France itself. But ambition has its price. As Napoleon's power expanded, so did the number of his enemies. The monarchs of Europe, humiliated and fearful, gathered strength once again. Britain's navy ruled the seas, denying France the maritime dominance it needed. To break British resistance, Napoleon would attempt an economic siege, the continental system, that would entangle him in disastrous wars to come. For now, however, he stood at the height of his glory, master of Europe, architect of a new order, and heir to the revolution's dreams. Yet even at the zenith of his empire, the seeds of his downfall were already taking root, not in Paris, but in the frozen East, where his greatest gamble awaited. Part 6. The Fall of the Emperor, Waterloo and Aftermath. By 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte stood as the master of Europe. From Lisbon to Warsaw, the map had been redrawn in his image. Kingdoms were ruled by his brothers, client states governed by his marshals. The old dynasties trembled, the church was subdued, and the principles of the revolution, merit, equality, and law, had been welded to the iron frame of empire. But empires built on ambition are fragile things. For every triumph, there lurked the fatal illusion of invincibility. And Napoleon, who had reshaped the continent through genius and will, was about to confront the limits of both. The first crack appeared in Spain. To enforce his continental system, an economic blockade designed to strangle Britain's trade, Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 1808. He overthrew the Spanish king and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. But what seemed a minor adjustment of dynastic chess pieces became a quagmire. The Spanish people rose in revolt, launching a guerrilla war that bled the French army dry. British troops under the Duke of Wellington landed in Portugal, turning the peninsula into a wound that refused to heal. For the first time, the emperor's legions faltered, not from grand battles lost, but from a people's relentless resistance. Still, Napoleon's gaze fixed elsewhere. His true obsession was Russia. The uneasy alliance with Tsar Alexander I was collapsing under mutual distrust. In 1812, determined to enforce his will, Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, more than 600,000 men from across Europe, and marched east. It was the largest army the world had ever seen, a monument to his power. But Russia was not a battlefield, it was an abyss. The Russians refused open confrontation, retreating and burning their own land in a scorched earth defense. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and aflame. Winter closed in, food ran out, and the army began its nightmare retreat. Freezing, starving, and harried by Russian attacks, fewer than 100,000 men returned. The Grande Armée had ceased to exist. The catastrophe shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. Across Europe, old enemies sensed their chance. Prussia, Austria, and Britain formed a new coalition, joined by a resurgent Russia. The following year, at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced them all. It was his greatest defeat. By 1814, coalition armies were marching into France itself. Paris fell, his marshals mutinied. The Emperor of Europe was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, and for a moment it seemed the story had ended. But Napoleon was not done. In March 1815, he escaped Elba and landed on the French coast with a handful of men. As he marched north, troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. "Soldiers," he declared, "if there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." None did. In a few weeks he was back in Paris, emperor once more. The world held its breath. This was the 100 Days, a final gamble by a man who refused to accept defeat. That gamble ended on June 18, 1815, at a Belgian village called Waterloo. Facing Wellington's British forces and Blucher's Prussian army, Napoleon's final battle was a desperate bid to reclaim glory. Through driving rain and mud, the French assaults came again and again, but the discipline of Wellington's lines held firm. When the Prussians arrived late in the day, the French line broke. By evening, Napoleon's army was in full retreat. The emperor's last gamble had failed. Exiled once more, this time to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena, Napoleon lived out his final years dictating his memoirs, convinced history would vindicate him. He died in 1821, far from the Europe he had once dominated, but his legacy refused to die. The Napoleonic Code, his administrative reforms, and the idea of nationalism he had ignited would shape Europe for generations. Even in defeat, the world he left behind bore his mark. France, however, was broken. The monarchy returned, but the old order could never truly be restored. The ideals Napoleon had spread, of equality before the law and the sovereignty of nations, had taken root too deeply. The empire was gone, but the dream of French grandeur endured. In time, that dream would be reborn, not through conquest in Europe, but through expansion overseas. If you're enjoying this journey through France's complex past, hit that like button. It helps more history lovers discover these stories. Part 7. Empire Reborn, the Conquest of Algeria. When Napoleon fell, France was left directionless, humiliated abroad, fractured at home, and unsure of what its destiny still meant. The monarchy had returned, but the world it tried to restore no longer existed. Yet even as the nation stumbled through political instability, one idea endured: the longing for grandeur, for empire. That dream would be reborn not in Europe but across the sea, on the sun-scorched shores of North Africa. The conquest of Algeria would become both the foundation of France's Second Empire and the beginning of a century-long entanglement that would define its colonial identity. The spark came from an insult. In 1827, a dispute erupted between France and the Regency of Algiers over unpaid debts for grain supplied during Napoleon's wars. During a tense meeting the Dey of Algiers, Hussein struck the French consul with a fly whisk, a gesture that Paris transformed into a national humiliation. The shaky Bourbon monarchy, desperate for a distraction from domestic unrest, seized the opportunity. It would avenge its pride and rally the nation behind a colonial crusade. In June 1830, a French armada of over 600 ships and 34,000 troops crossed the Mediterranean and landed west of Algiers. Within weeks, the city fell. The Dey surrendered and was sent into exile, ending 3 centuries of Ottoman rule. What had begun as a limited punitive expedition became something far greater: the birth of a new empire. Officially, the government claimed it had no ambition beyond restoring order, but France soon annexed the territory. The conquest of Algiers awakened something dormant, a hunger for power and expansion that would soon redefine France's place in the world. Yet Algeria did not submit quietly. Beyond the coastal cities lay a vast and complex land: mountains, deserts, and fiercely independent tribes. From this resistance emerged a remarkable leader, Emir Abdul-Qadir. A warrior, scholar, and spiritual figure, Abdul-Qadir united Algeria's fractured tribes under a single banner. From 1832 onward, he waged a relentless guerrilla war against French occupation, combining Islamic faith with modern military strategy. His army struck swiftly and vanished into the desert. At his height, Abdel-Qadir controlled nearly 2/3 of Algeria and forced France into treaties recognizing his rule. Paris refused to accept defeat. Determined to crush resistance, it unleashed a war of annihilation. By the 1840s, France had committed more than 100,000 troops to Algeria, waging scorched earth campaigns that burned villages, destroyed crops, and targeted civilians. Entire regions were depopulated. The toll was staggering. Historians estimate that between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians, nearly a third of the population, died through war, famine, and disease in the first 3 decades of conquest. In 1847, Abdel-Qadir, surrounded and outnumbered, surrendered. His surrender marked the end of organized resistance, but not of suffering. France declared Algeria part of its national territory, dividing it into administrative departments as if it were another province of France itself. But this was a fiction. The European settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, were granted citizenship and land, while the Muslim majority were ruled under separate, discriminatory laws. The colonized were not French citizens, but subjects, denied political rights in their own homeland. For France, Algeria became a symbol of rebirth, proof that, after the humiliation of Waterloo, the nation could still command and conquer. It was celebrated as a civilizing mission, a supposed act of enlightenment and progress. In truth, it was an occupation maintained by violence and inequality. The conquest of Algeria fused military glory with colonial ideology, giving France both a sense of recovered power and a new imperial identity. The war had transformed France. The same revolutionary ideals that once promised liberty were now used to justify domination. Soldiers who had once marched under Napoleon now marched through desert sands in the name of civilization. The empire that had died on the fields of Europe had been reborn across the Mediterranean, and it was only the beginning. From Algeria, French ambition would spread across Africa and Asia, building the largest empire France had ever known. Part 8, The Scramble for Africa, France's new imperial ambition. By the middle of the 19th century, the tricolour once again fluttered across foreign lands. Algeria had given France back its sense of mission, a symbol that the nation could still command, conquer, and civilize. Yet Algeria was only the beginning. Across Europe, industrialization, nationalism, and the hunger for global prestige were reshaping the world. The British Empire was expanding at a breathtaking pace. Germany and Italy were unifying into new powers. France, haunted by the memory of lost glory, refused to be left behind. Its answer was a new wave of conquest, the vast and frenetic expansion known as the Scramble for Africa. The French drive for empire after 1870 was deeply tied to humiliation. The Franco-Prussian War had ended in disaster. Paris had fallen, Alsace and Lorraine were lost, and the Second Empire of Napoleon III lay in ruins. Out of defeat came the Third Republic, a government desperate to restore France's national pride. Colonial expansion became its instrument of redemption, a way to heal the wounds of loss by projecting power abroad. Politicians, soldiers, and missionaries united under a single rallying cry: France's destiny was global. In Africa, the empire grew with astonishing speed. From their footholds in Senegal and Algeria, French expeditions pressed inland, determined to link their North and West African territories into one continuous domain stretching from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. In 1881, Tunisia became a protectorate. In 1883, French forces advanced up the Niger River, forging new colonies with the stroke of a treaty or the barrel of a rifle. Soldiers, explorers, and administrators, men like Pierre Savognin de Brazza and Louis Faidherbe, became national heroes, their exploits celebrated in Parisian papers as triumphs of civilization. The ideology behind this expansion was captured in the phrase mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. France cast itself as a bearer of progress, bringing schools, railways, and the French language to the so-called backward regions of the world. But beneath the rhetoric of enlightenment lay exploitation and control. The colonies were economic engines, sources of raw materials, cheap labour, and markets for French industry. African lands were reorganised not for their people, but for profit. Roads and railways were built to move goods from mines and plantations to the ports that fed the metropole. By the 1890s, the French colonial map of Africa had exploded in size. French West Africa was formally created, encompassing vast territories that would later become Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Ivory Coast. French Equatorial Africa soon followed, linking Gabon, Chad, and the Congo Basin under French administration. By the dawn of the 20th century, France controlled over 4 million square miles of African territory, a domain second only to the British Empire. Yet for all its size, the empire's foundation was fragile. Its borders were drawn not by geography or culture, but by European negotiation. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, convened to regulate the partition of Africa, saw diplomats divide the continent with rulers and pens, carving through ancient kingdoms and ethnic lands. The map that emerged would sow conflicts that outlasted empire itself. On paper, France's holdings looked immense. On the ground, they were patchworks of alliances, resistance, and coercion. Meanwhile, the empire was expanding eastward as well. In Asia, French forces were consolidating their hold over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, territories that would form French Indochina. What began as a series of punitive expeditions against local rulers became a new colonial system designed for extraction. Rice, rubber, opium all flowed toward France. The same contradictions that defined Africa defined Indochina: liberty at home, subjugation abroad. At the height of this expansion, French politicians spoke of a greater France, a vast global realm where the ideals of 1789 supposedly illuminated the world. But for millions of colonial subjects, that light came with the shadow of forced labor, cultural suppression, and military rule. The empire's grandeur masked its contradictions, and those contradictions would soon be tested in the crucible of a new kind of war, one that would demand loyalty and sacrifice from every corner of the French world. France had once measured its greatness in kings and revolutions. Now it measured it in colonies. The flag that had fallen at Waterloo now flew over deserts, jungles, and distant archipelagos. Yet even as the empire reached its zenith, the same ideals that had once torn down monarchs were quietly gathering strength again, and they would not stay silent forever. Part 9. Indochina and the East. Prophet, Paradox, and Empire. While France's armies were carving a new dominion across Africa, another empire was taking shape thousands of miles away in Asia, one that would become both a jewel of colonial ambition and a source of bitter reckoning. This was French Indochina, a realm born not from discovery, but from conquest and control. From the 1850s to the dawn of the 20th century, France's reach extended deep into the heart of Southeast Asia, to the rice fields of Vietnam, the temples of Cambodia, and the mountain kingdoms of Laos. But behind the rhetoric of civilization lay a harsher truth. Indochina was an empire of profit, exploitation, and contradiction. The story began under Napoleon III, nephew of the great emperor, who sought to restore French prestige through overseas expansion. France's pretext for intervention was familiar: the protection of Catholic missionaries and the spread of faith and civilization. But the real motives were strategic and economic. Southeast Asia sat at the crossroads of maritime trade between India and China. Controlling it would give France both prestige and profit, a foothold to rival Britain's empire in the east. In 1858, French forces attacked Da Nang, and by 1862 they had seized the southern region of Vietnam, establishing the colony of Cochinchina. Over the next 2 decades, the conquests spread north. By 1887, the territories of Cochinchina, Annam, Tonkin, and Cambodia were united under a single administration, French Indochina. Laos would be added in 1893. On maps, it was painted the same colour as France, a vast colonial jewel linking the Mekong Delta to the South China Sea. But beneath the facade of civilization, the system was built on control. France imposed heavy taxes and monopolies on salt, opium, and rice alcohol. Local economies were restructured to feed the metropole. The land became a machine for extraction, rubber, coal, rice, and tin flowing outward to enrich Paris and Marseille. Vietnamese laborers, known as coolies, toiled in plantations and mines under brutal conditions, often bound by debt and overseen by French foremen who viewed them as expendable. Mortality rates were staggering. Exploitation was institutionalized. Education, too, served the colonial design. French schools taught the language and culture of the colonizer while suppressing local traditions. A small elite of Vietnamese scholars and administrators emerged, loyal to France, fluent in its values, yet denied equality. They became intermediaries in a system that preached progress but practiced segregation. The contradiction was total. The republic that proclaimed liberté, égalité, fraternité at home denied all three abroad. Still, the empire's influence reshaped the region. French engineers built ports, railways, and canals. French architects remade Saigon and Hanoi into miniature replicas of Paris. The colony became a showcase of imperial pride, the Pearl of the East. Yet beneath the boulevards and colonial villas, resentment was growing. Educated Vietnamese, exposed to Western ideals, began to see the hypocrisy of French rule. Out of the classrooms and the streets emerged new voices calling for independence. Quiet at first, but gathering strength with each passing generation. For France, Indochina was both triumph and paradox. It represented the height of colonial power, the tangible proof that France remained a global force. But it also revealed the deep moral fissures within the empire, the same ideals that once overthrew kings and proclaimed human rights were now used to justify domination and exploitation. In the words of one French critic of the time, "We teach liberty, but we rule through force." By the early 20th century, France's colonial world spanned Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Over 60 million people ruled from Paris. It was the second largest empire on Earth, a global web of languages, religions, and economies bound together by coercion and trade. But such vast systems are only stable when their centre holds. And as Europe lurched toward the cataclysm of the First World War, the colonies would be called upon to defend the very nation that denied them equality. When the cannons of 1914 thundered, the French Empire went to war, not as a distant observer, but as a vital engine of manpower and resources. The next chapter in France's imperial saga would be written not in distant colonies, but in the trenches of Europe. Part 10. World at War, the Empire's Crucible. When Europe descended into the abyss of the First World War, the French Empire, vast, diverse, and deeply divided, became a lifeline for the Republic. In 1914, the call to arms reached far beyond Paris or Marseille. It echoed across deserts, jungles, and rice fields, summoning soldiers from Africa, Asia, and the Pacific to fight in a war they neither started nor fully understood. The struggle for survival on the Western Front would transform not only France but the very foundation of its empire. From Senegal to Algeria, from Indochina to Madagascar, colonial subjects were mobilized on an unprecedented scale. The French government conscripted hundreds of thousands of men to serve as soldiers and laborers. Over 450,000 African troops were deployed, including the famed tirailleurs sénégalais, infantry units drawn from West Africa. They fought in Belgium, at Verdun, at the Somme, names that would forever be linked to slaughter. Thousands more came from Morocco, Tunisia, and Indochina, crossing oceans to die in the mud of Europe's fields. They were told they were defending La Patrie, the motherland, a land many had never seen. Their contribution was immense. Without the colonies, France could not have survived. The empire provided not only men, but also food, raw materials, and strategic bases. Rubber from Indochina, phosphates from North Africa, gold from West Africa, all sustained the war effort. Colonial workers were shipped to France to labor in munitions factories and shipyards, keeping the machinery of war alive. The empire, in essence, became the body that fed the heart of France. But the experience of war changed everything. In the trenches, colonial soldiers fought and died beside white Frenchmen, sharing rations, fear, and sacrifice. The myth of European superiority began to fracture. Men who had been told they were subjects discovered that their courage equaled any soldier's. They returned home with new awareness, not of servitude, but of worth. The war that had been meant to preserve empire had, in some ways, begun to unravel it. The interwar years brought both expansion and fragility. France emerged victorious in 1918, but at a terrible cost. A generation lost, its economy shattered. The empire, however, grew. Germany's colonies in Africa, Togo and Cameroon, were placed under French mandate. In the Middle East, France gained Syria and Lebanon under the League of Nations, extending its influence from Dakar to Damascus. On paper, this was the height of French imperial power. Yet cracks were spreading. Across Africa and Asia, nationalist movements were quietly forming, inspired by the very ideals France claimed as its own. Then came 1940. Catastrophe once more. Nazi Germany swept across France in weeks, and the once mighty republic fell. The homeland was divided, half occupied, half ruled by the collaborationist Vichy regime. But in the empire, France's spirit endured. From Brazzaville in French Equatorial Africa, General Charles de Gaulle declared resistance, forming the Free French Forces. The colonies became sanctuaries and arsenals for liberation. From North Africa to the Pacific, French soldiers and colonial troops fought to restore their nation's honour. In the deserts of Libya and Tunisia, in the mountains of Italy, and on the beaches of Provence, men from Africa and Indochina marched beneath the tricolour once more. They helped liberate Paris in 1944, cheered by crowds who often did not recognise how many of their liberators came from beyond Europe. Yet for those soldiers, victory brought not equality, but disappointment. When the war ended, they were sent home, their sacrifices acknowledged with medals, but not with freedom. The contradiction at the heart of the empire could no longer be ignored. France had fought 2 world wars in the name of liberty and democracy, yet continued to rule millions who were denied both. In 1945, as Europe celebrated peace, unrest exploded across the empire. Protests in Sétif, Algeria, demanding independence were crushed by French forces, leaving thousands dead. Similar uprisings simmered in Madagascar, Syria, and Vietnam. The post-war world was changing fast, and France's empire, once seen as a source of strength, was now becoming a burden. The empires of Europe had survived the guns of Verdun and the tanks of Normandy, but they would not survive the age of decolonization. The next battles France would fight would not be against foreign powers, but against its own history, in the jungles of Indochina and the streets of Algiers. Part 11. The Wars of Decolonization, Indochina to Algeria. The guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, but for France, peace did not bring rest. Across its empire, the people who had fought, bled, and laboured for the Republic were no longer content with promises. They had heard the words liberty and equality repeated through 2 global wars, yet still lived under colonial rule. The age of empire was dying, and France would not let it go quietly. Between 1946 and 1962, 2 brutal wars, one in Asia, one in North Africa, would tear apart what remained of French imperial glory and reshape the nation's soul. The first battlefront lay in Indochina. In September 1945, only weeks after Japan's surrender, a small determined figure stood before a crowd in Hanoi and declared Vietnam's independence. Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Viet Minh, invoked the very words of the American Declaration of Independence and the ideals of the French Revolution. But Paris would not accept it. Determined to reclaim its colony, France sent troops to reoccupy the region, igniting the First Indochina War. The conflict was a brutal mismatch, a modern army fighting a guerrilla force that understood the land, the people, and the politics of patience. The Viet Minh, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, fought not to win battles but to survive and wear down French will. France, backed by American funds fearful of communist expansion, poured men and material into the struggle, but every victory seemed hollow. Villages were destroyed, civilians displaced, and soldiers worn down by an enemy that vanished into the jungle. In 1954, the war reached its grim crescendo at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northern Vietnam. The French established a massive fortified base, confident they could bait the Viet Minh into a decisive fight. Instead, Giap surrounded them, hauling heavy artillery through mountains and jungle. For 56 days, shells rained down. Supply drops failed, morale collapsed, and on May 7th, the French garrison surrendered. Dien Bien Phu was more than a military defeat. It was an imperial reckoning. The illusion of France's global dominance shattered in a single valley. That same year, the Geneva Accords granted independence to Laos and Cambodia and divided Vietnam temporarily into North and South. For France, Asia was lost. But even as Indochina slipped away, another and more personal struggle erupted, this time in the heart of what many French still considered part of France itself, Algeria. On November 1st, 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched coordinated attacks across the country, marking the start of the Algerian War of Independence. It was not a colonial rebellion on the fringes of empire, it was a war at the empire's core. The FLN fought a guerrilla campaign from the mountains and the cities, while France responded with overwhelming force. The French army, hardened by Indochina, brought modern weaponry and counterinsurgency tactics to bear. Paratroopers and intelligence units hunted insurgents through the Kasbah of Algiers. Torture and summary executions became commonplace. France's claim to be the guardian of liberty and civilization was now stained by the methods it used to preserve empire. The war tore French society apart, between those who saw Algeria as an inseparable province of France and those who accepted that the age of empire was over. In 1958, amid political chaos and army mutinies, General Charles de Gaulle returned to power. Many believed he would preserve French Algeria. Instead, he saw what others could not, that the war was unwinnable, that France's future lay not in domination but in reconstruction. His decision to negotiate with the FLN was seen as betrayal by hardline generals and settlers. The extremist OAS, Organisation Armée Secrète, launched a campaign of terror, bombing cities in both Algeria and France in a desperate attempt to prevent independence. Despite the violence, de Gaulle pressed on. In March 1962, the Evian Accords were signed, ending the war and granting Algeria full independence. What followed was chaos, the mass exodus of nearly 1 million Pieds Noirs settlers and the tragic massacres of tens of thousands of Muslim Algerians who had fought alongside France. The empire was finished. Within a decade, nearly all of France's colonies had gained independence. What remained was no longer an empire, but a shadow, a network of cultural, linguistic and economic ties that hinted at a past too painful to forget. The wars of decolonization left scars deeper than defeat. They shattered the myth of France as a universal model of liberty, forcing the nation to confront the gulf between its ideals and its actions. Yet from that reckoning would emerge a new vision, a France that sought to lead not through empire, but through influence, culture, and cooperation. Part 12: Legacy and Reckoning, the empire that never truly ended. When the last tricolour flag was lowered over Algiers in 1962, it marked not just the end of an empire, but the end of an era, centuries of conquest, expansion, and ambition drawn to a close. Yet the story of the French Empire did not vanish with its collapse. Its echoes lingered, in language, in culture, in memory. France may have abandoned the title of empire, but the empire never truly abandoned France. The loss of Algeria struck like a national trauma. For a generation raised on the myth of La plus grande France, Greater France, the realization was staggering. A country that had once ruled over 60 million subjects across 5 continents was suddenly confined to Europe. The political aftershocks were immense. De Gaulle, architect of independence, recast the nation's identity. The Fifth Republic emerged in 1958 as a modern, centralized state built not on imperial prestige, but on national renewal. Yet beneath its stability, old wounds festered, questions of belonging, migration, and memory that France still wrestles with today. Across the former colonies, independence brought both liberation and turbulence. New nations emerged: Vietnam, Senegal, Mali, Cambodia, Algeria, carrying with them the imprint of French language, bureaucracy, and law. Paris had once ruled them through governors and generals. Now it sought to lead through culture, trade, and diplomacy. The web of relations known as the Francophonie, a global community of French-speaking nations, became France's post-colonial inheritance, a softer form of influence that replaced direct rule. The empire's physical borders had dissolved, but its cultural reach endured. The legacy was deeply ambivalent. On one hand, France's empire had spread education, technology, and infrastructure. On the other, it had imposed domination, violence, and exploitation. In Africa, economic dependence persisted through the CFA franc system and political influence known as France-Afrique, where French interests and elites remained entwined long after independence. The empire had ended in law, but not in practice. The old power structures lingered, subtle, economic, and psychological. Within France itself, the end of empire reshaped society. Millions of immigrants from North and West Africa, the Caribbean, and Indochina came to the metropole seeking opportunity. Their labour rebuilt post-war France, powering its factories and cities. Yet they also brought memories of conquest, colonization, and loss. The colonial past became part of the French present, visible in every Parisian suburb, every accent and street name, every debate about identity. The empire had come home. Culturally, the legacy was profound. The French language became a bridge connecting continents, spoken in Dakar, Montreal, Hanoi, and Algiers. The principles of the Napoleonic Code influenced legal systems across the globe. French art, architecture, and ideals of universalism left a permanent mark on the modern world. But so too did the contradictions: a republic that preached human rights while denying them to millions, a civilization that claimed to enlighten even as it enslaved. As historians look back, the French Empire stands as one of the most paradoxical in history. It was born from revolution and rationalism, yet justified itself through domination. It carried both the torch of progress and the shadow of exploitation. It gave the world ideals that inspired liberation and systems that demanded it. The same cry of liberty that rang out in 1789 echoed in the independence movements that finally brought the empire down. Today, France continues to reckon with that past, in its politics, its classrooms, and its conscience. Statues of conquerors stand uneasily beside memorials to the enslaved. Streets named after colonial generals run through cities filled with their descendants. The debate over memory and responsibility is ongoing, but so too is the dialogue that empire made possible, a shared, if complicated, story between nations once bound by conquest. In the end, the empire's true legacy may not lie in territory or treasure, but in ideas that could not be contained by the borders of empire or the walls of power. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, born in revolution and carried through conquest, came full circle. They outlasted kings, emperors, and colonies. They became the very language through which the colonized demanded freedom. The French Empire, like all empires, rose and fell. But its echoes remain in the words people speak, the systems they inherit, and the questions they still ask about justice, power, and belonging. It was an empire that sought to rule the world, but in doing so, it changed the world, and, in the end, changed itself.